Good Shabbos, everyone. The widely regarded leader of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, in word and act, has long spoken of the way that a person facing their greatest fears can illumine a darkened path for others. He has pointed out throughout his tenure in leadership toward others around him whose courage inspired him and on whose insights he relied during his time in a Robben Island prison cell under apartheid, as well as when he emerged from that cell to lead his nation's difficult transformation from degradation in apartheid to the glory of human equality realized. As we pray here tonight in Cleveland, Mandela's condition it remains intensely fragile. The world remains attuned to news of his well-being. But I think it both a prayerful and helpful act tonight to be reminded of Mandela's precise words on that matter of facing our fears and impacting others around us. In his book, Long Walk to Freedom, he encouraged us that facing our fears is a way of letting our own light shine. By openly admitting and then facing those fears, we unconsciously give other people around us permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others, Mandela said. I've been thinking about his powerful words of witness a great deal in facing recent weeks of world events. Mostly, I've been trying to not face these weeks of world events. I've been meditating quite a bit over these recent days, trying to close my eyes and center my thoughts and intention around sources of meaning, of liberation. Beginning with the story of our Jewish people, the Exodus from Egypt, and moving my attention to the fears that each one of us try and vanquish every day. Then I opened my eyes from meditation to look around me. In recent weeks then, I've watched, along with many of you, the troubling events touching our nation, the anguish that many have felt invested in the outcome of the recent Zimmerman trial in Florida, the news just yesterday of the plunging of my home community, the city of Detroit, into the largest bankruptcy in American metropolitan history, and the seemingly intractable array of political fistfights that are making the news, blocking progress and momentum on so many important areas in national and state debate. In Columbus this week in which we are remembering a year since gun violence erupted in an Aurora, Colorado movie theater, some knucklehead thought this was a good time to move forward on a bill called HB 203, which would change Ohio's law and make it easier to get a concealed carry permit here. This week of all weeks, we're hearing about how important it is to remove minimum training requirements and clear the current obstacles for people charged with possession of narcotics or against whom there is a restraining order. I don't think you have to know me too well to know that I'm kind of troubled. My pulse is racing. My brows are more or less permanently on furrow. I'm frightened by the tumult around me. In junior high school, I remember them teaching us about President Roosevelt's statement that there is nothing to fear but fear itself. In Hebrew school, the same year, I got the sense that FDR was relying on the example set by the Israelites in Torah. An ancient Israelite tribe freed by God's hand, liberated, but unwilling to let go with its own hands of its grip on fear as an organizing principle. In other words, we in modernity have been like our ancient forebears, more comfortable being subject to the other, rather than empowered by the presence of others powerfully affecting us on a day-to-day basis, walking alongside us and, like Mandela encourages us, facing fears. In the Torah, the other was an Egyptian taskmaster. But today, the other against whom an ingredient of our relationship of fear is more amorphous. We hold fear of strangers who might be standing behind us in the grocery aisle or in the school pickup lane. We are afraid of people who live right around the corner, not in some other encampment across a border. There is no escaping the fear people humanly experience when traveling through security in our nation's airports, or when finding their way back to their cars after a ball game, or contemplating the fact that many of our kids get on their bikes and ride home from school. Isn't school, in fact, the place in our society that most teaches us to fear the other? This all leads me to a very basic question at the core of my D'var Torah tonight, which is this: what are you afraid of? What are the most common fears any of us hold? Well, I asked around a bit this week. We're afraid of heights, people said. Afraid to stand on the rooftops of tall buildings and risk breathing in and out at such a high altitude. We're afraid of loud noises, especially loud ones that occur in the dark of night, which means that we're afraid of the dark, of being shocked about what might happen in a place of darkness and vulnerability. These are just a few of the fears that people have. I have a long list myself. Whatever list you compile, the wide sampling of triggers that draw out our fear make us instinctually believe that we are in harm's way. As a rabbi, when I study the sources of our tradition, I see a good number of things that we remain afraid of in the ancient list of plagues that the composers of Torah imagined as afflictions against Pharaoh and the Egyptians in order to secure the Israelites' freedom. They in Egypt and we in modern-day America experience a fear of violence, a fear of blood, fear of darkness, fear of pestilence, of disease, of wild animals. And of course, topping the list, a fear of something happening to our kids. How about a fear of flying? Anyone here afraid of flying? It's not easy. It's not easy to face that fear. Afraid when you or a loved one get on an airplane. Part of that fear goes back to the fear of heights, but another part of our fear of flying is the fear of being truly vulnerable. Vulnerable to the elements, yes, but also to strangers. Placing our own well-being and our safety in a stranger's hands. The pilot, who controls the airplane, the strangers in the air traffic control center, who mark out pathways for safe takeoff, routing, and landing. Be honest. Aren't you at least a little bit afraid when you get on board an airplane? The first time I flew without my parents, it was in the company of my two older brothers, Bruce and Steve, who, let's just say, have never been a source of comfort in times of fear. We were going down, the three boys, to visit my grandparents in Clearwater, Florida, and they let us board early as kids, long enough to get ourselves settled, but also long enough to listen to the flight crew preparing both the inner and outer parts of the plane. A buzzer went off, then a ding of the flight crew's phone bell. We listened to the early boarding process, to the very sounds of the baggage belt being set up to carry our suitcases aboard. I heard a sound like a thud, and then slightly fainter thud that came after it. I turned to my brother Bruce and said, "What was that?" He looked at me. He saw his moment. And he leapt on top of me and yelled, "It's a bomb! It's a bomb!" For which he'd be arrested today. I read not long ago the testimony of my colleague Rabbi Karyn Kedar about her own fear of flying. She shared this as a short story in the book Dance of the Dolphins, an exquisite memoir of the various spiritually impactful experiences she has had. As she told her airplane story, Rabbi Kedar describes her fear each time she boards an airplane like this. It's a fear that something's going to go wrong. She also admits there's another fear, that as a rabbi, she doesn't like being exposed to the people around her as running short on faith in a modern-day airplane. She says and I'm sure some of you who travel regularly recognize this, there's an unwritten code while flying during business traveler rush. There will be no eye contact. Eye contact could only lead to conversation, and conversation inevitably leads to the most dreaded question in those circumstances. So, what do you do? An honest answer to that question, Rabbi Kedar reflects, leads to an unwanted conversation that only has a few texts. Oh, a rabbi, really? I never knew women could be rabbis. Or I haven't been in a temple since my bar mitzvah. Or you'd never believe what a rabbi I knew once said to me. Or how is it that you do not believe in our Savior? So I follow the code. Eyes slightly down or blankly straight ahead. Rabbi Kedar reflects, once I was on my way home from a book signing, settled in my seat, trying to look relaxed. It was the last flight of the day. The plane was filled with business people. Trying not to break the code, I glanced swiftly at the person across the aisle from me, just quickly enough to see that he was a young man in his 20s, probably in sales. He was looking straight ahead. He knew the rules. I closed my eyes during takeoff and said my customary prayer. God, may it be your will that we reach our destination in peace. And then I repeated the phrase, may it be your will, over and over until we reached altitude. And then I read to keep my mind distracted. We were in our final approach to O'Hare when I suddenly hit unbelievable turbulence. The plane tilted side to side, up and down with such intensity that I was sure the pilot's knuckles were as white as my face. I glanced outside to see how close we were to the ground and wondered how many miles we could plummet but still survive. I closed my eyes and prayed in pulsating whispers for courage, for life, and for courage for hope that eternity exists, and for courage for children, my children, and for their courage. And then I felt the weight of a large hand on my shoulder. Although I didn't open my eyes, I knew it was the hand of the young man across the aisle. The words of my prayer merged with the warmth of his touch. And for what seemed like a lifetime, but was only a moment, we were still. My eyes turned toward God, his hand securely on my shoulder. And we landed safely. I opened my eyes and looked into his. We smiled. He said, I saw that you were praying, and I wanted you to know you were not alone. I was praying too. Still shaken, I whispered, thank you. Then we stood up, and as we left the plane, he said, so, what do you do? I'm a writer, I said. Well, what brought you to Detroit? He asked. I was at a book signing, she replied. What's the name of your book? God Whispers, I answered. Busted, as my 10-year-old daughter would say. God Whispers. Boy, was I praying with the right person, he said. And that was the last thing he said. We walked briskly, no more speaking, no eye contact. We knew the rules. He went to the right for ground transportation. I went to the left toward baggage claim. But I still feel his hand on my shoulder every time I'm scared. I read that story aloud this morning to a person I know who has been afraid lately. Afraid enough to panic, and strong enough to say, I need some help to soothe these fears. My friend said of Rabbi Kedar's story that no one can take away your turbulence. I'm going to remember that. There isn't just one thing or one person that can fix you. What helps when you are afraid is not that someone stops what's making you afraid. It's just knowing that there's an energy committed to you, letting you know in this moment, you are not alone. You're not alone. Boy, I like that message on this Shabbat, in this difficult moment in time in our history. Tonight on this Shabbat, we need to not feel alone. And just as we open our eyes to a turbulent and violent and often chaotic society around us, it often makes us afraid for our lives. So are we also reminded by that rabbi's example of the simplicity of just accepting another being's energy when it is committed toward us? Her example of acceptance of a hand she'd never have asked for to steady her own racing heart and mind, a hand being offered to her freely from a person she probably will never see again, but that deepens her resolve to this day to pray with sincerity. She says the real prayer she experienced rested not in her thoughts nor in his, but in the space between them. In that moment, prayer took the form of touch, sensation of a great hand resting across a vast isolated space and making contact. Something greater than us, an energy reaching across a vast chasm and making contact. As we take steps to figure out in this moment who needs our care, as we travel from this Shabbat to the next, surely there will be moments where we are afraid. But as real and as true as any of those experiences of darkness, oppression, fear of heights, fear of flying, fear of driving, fear of living, is the message that my friend whom I read that story to is hoping to feel. It's a simple message. In this moment, you are not alone.